Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Logos Project. This is your host, Dom. In today's video, I'm joined by Dr. Shaun Blanchard to speak about Jansenism and the Synod of Pistoia. Shaun, how are you doing?
I'm doing great, Dom. Thanks for having me on the show. I'll talk
Anytime.
about Jansenism with anyone who will listen.
Anytime. It's good to have you on. So this is a fascinating historical chronology, a movement. And I have a lot of questions. I don't know that much about it, so I'm glad to have you on because this is your subject matter, right? You're the SME, subject matter expert. So I guess to kick things off, maybe could we start? A good background might be the De Auxiliis controversy. What in the world is that, and how is that related to Jansenism?
Yeah, definitely. So De Auxiliis is it is well. I mean, I sort of Americanized my pronunciation there. I think you were
You're
much
good.
better, Dom. But it's one of those things that gets said so often that it gets kind of
Yeah.
the pronunciation changes. But yeah. So basically, to understand when I teach about Jansenism in class, I start with, or I describe it as a series of controversies, a movement that arises out of the reception of
Mhm.
the Council of Trent. So one way we can kind of bracket it
Okay.
chronologically is we can think of Reformation, Counter Reformation, Catholic Reformation, however we want to talk about that, through to the French Revolution.
Mm.
That's one way to tell the story. Another way to tell the story of this set of controversies would be to begin in the 18th century and to bracket it more as about Enlightenment and Reformed Catholicism, and then go all the way to Vatican II. So we're going back, which is one
Okay.
important way to tell the story. But I think we're going to do both if we have time.
Sure.
So basically, I would say there's sort of three things at play here. On one hand, you have the Council of Trent condemns Lutheranism and Calvinism,
Mhm.
at least insofar as it perceives certain ideas to be Lutheran or Calvinist. Some
Mhm.
of those ideas are related to divine grace. Okay, so you have this kind of out of bounds marker for Catholic theology. You can't say what Luther and Calvin are saying about the divine will or the
Mhm.
relationship between good works and faith, etc. On the other hand, they obviously condemn Pelagianism. You know,
Mhm.
they reaffirm the numerous condemnations of Pelagianism, but they
Mhm.
don't solve all of the problems and all of the questions. So one question and problem that comes up um, very quickly is related to what is the proper Catholic understanding. Okay, so we can't be Pelagians, we can't be Calvinists, but what actually do we teach? And there was a professor at the University of Louvain, which is in modern day Belgium, named Michel de Bay, who is known as Bias. So Bias had this very kind of extreme Augustinian take, um,
Okay.
very much de-emphasized the power of human reason and the human will, and massively
Mm.
emphasized predestination, grace, etc. So
Yeah.
Bias is condemned by Pope Pius V in 1567, a bull called Ex Omnibus. But this is a kind of inconclusive condemnation for a number of reasons. So this debate continues,
Mhm.
and the two major parties of the debate are the Dominicans, who, of course, are Thomists, and they're specifically thinking through the lens of Banez, Domingo de Banez, I believe. But you could get a lot of people on the show that
Okay.
know a lot more about him than I do. But essentially, the Dominicans emphasize predestination. They emphasize what they call physical predetermination. Um,
Mm.
and they understand the human will as included in the divine will in a certain sense. It's a very complex debate, and they make, as always, dozens and dozens of distinctions. But they believe that essentially God offers sufficient grace to everyone, but efficient grace, the grace that actually leads to salvation, is offered to the elect. Okay, and I should say,
Hmm.
when we talk about predestination, Catholics today sometimes think, well, predestination, that's Protestant. That's the weird people who
Yeah.
knocked on my door, or the mean guy on Twitter, who or whatever.
Yeah.
But at this time in history, all Catholics believed in predestination, at least all the theologians, all the trained theologians, and they also believed in free will. So what they're trying to do is say, okay, God has decreed anyone who is saved is predestined, and nevertheless, people freely choose salvation, or they freely choose damnation. So this is a great mystery. How do we explain this? So the Thomists have this particular explanation. The Jesuits have their explanation. And of course, there are people in either camp that are not Dominicans and Jesuits.
And to this day, this is not resolved in Catholic theology, right? There's different options and different theories. Yeah. Okay.
Right. I mean, we mostly just don't talk about it anymore, which is in and of itself an interesting phenomenon, and I think it's related to the Jansenist crisis.
Okay.
And we can maybe go into that later. But
so
the Jesuit perspective with Molina is, and he's a scholastic theologian too, so he's thinking in these same categories. So he says, okay, God offers sufficient grace to everyone, and if they accept that grace, then the grace becomes efficient. Okay, so that's a really important difference, and the Dominicans worry that this is kind of smuggling maybe a semi-Pelagian in. Semi-Pelagianism is, and then the Jesuits go, hey, what are you doing? We're dealing with Luther and Calvin, and you're telling everyone that God only gives efficient grace to some people. That's not different from Luther and Calvin. So there's this massive row. And eventually the Pope kind of acts as a sort of referee. The popes weren't very proactive in their teaching at the time. They were more sort of guardians and referees. And the Pope at the time basically says, hey, stop arguing. You need to accept that the Molinists think differently and they're not heretics. The Dominicans think differently and they're not heretics. And that doesn't go over well with everyone. So Jansen's coming out of this. So Cornelius Jansen basically thinks, the Pope really should have condemned the Jesuit position as heresy. That's really semi-Pelagianism. And this is a strong motivation for what we now call Jansenism.
Okay. So it's really connected to a reaction against perceived semi-Pelagianism, because they believe that even though grace is offered to all, it has to be accepted in order to be effective towards salvation. Right. And so there seems to be a smuggling in here of some kind of human agency apart from grace, is the fear.
Yes,
it sounds
exactly.
Okay.
That's exactly right. Yep. Yeah, it's always good to be able to put these decades of debate into a couple sentences, but yeah, that's exactly right.
Okay. All right. So maybe talk a little bit more about Antoine Arnauld or Arnold.
Okay.
Who is this guy? Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
I'm sorry. I jumped ahead. Cornelius Jansen first. Sorry about that.
Yep.
Yeah.
No worries. Yeah. So basically, Jansenism, I would say, there's really kind of three founders. So Jansen is the most important in the sense of the kind of textual trail. So Cornelius Jansen was a professor. He's actually a professor, I believe, of sacred scripture at Louvain. Which at the time was in the Spanish Netherlands. So he was actually a subject of the King of Spain. The King of Spain actually was the one who nominated him for the episcopal see of Ypres, that he eventually, at the end of his life, was briefly a bishop. But he was this brilliant academic. He was very concerned with, he didn't like the Jesuits. He thought that they were on the wrong track for a number of reasons. He loved reading the Bible, lecturing on the Bible, and then he got really obsessed with St. Augustine, because he thought, okay, what are the great heresies, the great problems of my day are, I'm living next door to all these Calvinists, who he saw as basically fatalist in some of their views of God's will and providence and how free will works. And then he said, also, I have these Jesuits that are actually, they're so overreacting to Calvinism that they're basically, now they've resurrected this ancient heresy that we've sort of repeatedly condemned through the popes confirming St. Augustine's position against Pelagius or semi-Pelagian views, blah, 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 blah. So he writes this massive book called the Augustin. And he does it kind of in collaboration and in conversation with a French priest named Saint-Cyran. Saint Cyran is what it looks like in English, Saint-Cyran. And Saint-Cyran is this brilliant preacher and spiritual director. He's not as much of an academic. He's well-read, but he's more of a kind of on-the-ground pastoral networker. And he's linked in with these really devout, this very devout group of nuns who had reformed their convent outside of Paris, a place called Port Royal. And I'm sure we'll get into that later. But essentially, Jansen, he becomes bishop in 1636, dies in 1638, and then his massive tome, the Augustinos, that he'd worked on for years and years, he claims that he read all of Augustine's works 10 times. and all of
Wow.
Augustine's anti-Pelagian works 30 times. So the way that you and
Wow.
I can quote, I'm sure, Star Wars or Lord of the Rings or whatever, he could just quote from memory Augustine. So he really believed, I've got Augustine right. The church says Augustine is authoritative on these questions, at the very least on these questions, if not on everything. So these Thomists that you come across on Twitter, that's what Jansen was like for Augustine. All he quoted was Augustine. Augustine's right about everything, that kind of thing. So anyway, he dies of the plague actually in 1638. His book is published posthumously, 1640. It immediately causes controversy. Rome censures it because it violated the peace of De Auxiliis. So
Right.
you had to have a special permission to publish on this question, but people ignored that. And at that time, the papal control was very much limited by where you lived. So if you lived in Rome, absolutely, you're not getting away with anything without papal permission. But if you live in the Spanish Netherlands and the King of Spain likes you, you can get away with it. So anyway, Jansen dies. His book comes out, and it plunges the theological world into controversy. And Saint-Cyran is still around, and he's with this network of nuns who look to Jansen as this kind of holy man.
Spiritual father.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Saint-Cyran first and foremost, because he would preach retreats and he would hear their confessions, but they knew he was linked with this sort of brilliant interpreter of Augustine who they highly revered. And these were very intelligent, these were literate women. Many of them read Latin. They all read and wrote in French. So there's many kind of layers to this, socially and culturally here.
Yeah, fascinating. So yeah, Port Royal, the Royal Port Abbey, in France, outside of Paris. Okay, so this figure, Antoine Arnauld, when does he step in? What's his deal?
So Antoine Arnauld is kind of the leader of the second generation of Jansenists. So basically, his oldest sister, Angelique Arnauld, is the abbess of Port Royal.
Okay.
So it's kind of in the family. Blaise Pascal is connected with it. His niece is one of the nuns, Jacqueline Pascal, who was very, very devoted to Jansen and Saint-Cyran. So you have this kind of network of intellectuals, women religious, priests who are identifying as they would call themselves disciples of St. Augustine or friends of the truth. So I'll do this with my students will sometimes be like, my theology students, I'll say, oh, are you a Thomist, or are you a racehorse man, or what? And I'll go,
or Franciscan.
I'm a friend of the truth. So it can become this but it sort of, in some way, it sort of highlights a kind of arrogance as well, right? It's like, well, I'm just right, So you do get an elitism for sure at the earliest stages of this, whatever we want to call it, movement or network. Anyway, when Jansen, what's the right chronology here? The Pope eventually condemns 5 propositions from Jansen's book, allegedly from Jansen's book, and this causes a massive crisis.
Okay.
The King of France is really the one who wants the condemnation because he doesn't like people arguing about theology. Remember, he's dealing with a Protestant minority. He's dealing with a Huguenot minority. He's what we now would call an absolutist. He just wants everyone to agree about religion and then do what he tells them about who to conquer and all that.
What king was this again?
This is Louis XIV. This is a young Louis XIV.
So
the Sun King. Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
So Jansen's book is condemned, or 5 propositions from it, and Antoine Arnauld kind of steps into the breach as the new leader because Jansen's dead. Saint-Cyran is at the end of his life, and Cardinal Richelieu had put him in jail and he wasn't in good health. So the real kind of torchbearer is Antoine Arnauld, the youngest brother of Angelique Arnauld. It's a massive family. They also had a bishop, a couple other nuns in the family.
Wow.
It was like something like 13, 14 kids. So he's known as Le Grand Arnauld, the great Arnauld. Brilliant theologian, also a philosopher, a Cartesian philosopher. And he writes there's 2 really important things he does. He writes a book called On Frequent Communion, which is another facet of this problem, because connected with the issues of predestination and grace is the question of confession. And that is another unresolved issue, I think, in Catholic theology, or at least in sacramental practice. What is the right practice around denying communion, or when you should receive and how often and things like that.
Right.
So he writes this book on frequent communion that inflames the controversy with the Jesuits. The Jesuits are very much pushing more frequent communion, and they will absolve you. The key difference is the Jesuit position and the more sort of, I don't know, what laxist is what its opponents call it, is
Mhm.
all you need for absolution is attrition. So you
Mm.
can go into the confession and say, Father, I, say you're a stable boy, and you're like, Father, I keep meeting the shepherd girl in the woods and we keep having sex, and I need to repent of this because I want to receive communion.
Yeah.
And then the Jesuit priest would say, look, this is wrong. Do you recognize it's wrong? And you say, yes,
Yeah.
I'm afraid of going to hell, or I'm afraid of getting fired, or the girl's father finding us.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
they'll absolve you on the basis that you're afraid of punishment.
So no firm purpose of amendment.
Well, this is where it gets dicey. So
Okay. Yeah.
what a good Jesuit confessor would have said is, you're coming because your fear of God's justice, God's judgment, is a first step towards repentance and love of God, and we can
Mhm.
work with that. And you have to firmly amend, but then of course the Jansenist critique would be, well, they're not firmly amending. They're
Yeah.
coming back the next Saturday at between 4
Same
and
sin.
4:45
Yeah.
or whatever it was. I don't know.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
attrition basically is, because I am afraid of punishment, God's divine wrath, I want to be absolved. Okay. And
Mm.
the Jesuit would say that's a first step towards love, and I can work with that. So
Yeah.
that's the sympathetic interpretation. The Jansenist confessor, or the rigorist confessor, the Augustinian confessor, would say, everyone's afraid of punishment. Even demons are afraid of punishment. What
Mhm.
you need to be here because you love God, because you love the person you sinned against, or the person you sinned with, and
Mhm.
you love God. That's why you confess. And if you're not there, you need to go and do penance and come back. Okay.
So
And the
it's
Jesuit would say,
yeah.
why are you throwing a kid out of confession? Absolve the kid. Receiving communion means they will be fortified by grace to sin
I
less.
see.
And the Jansenist says, no, this is sacrilege. This kid's coming every week. He's doing the same thing. Anyway, sorry. Go ahead.
No. That's fascinating. So it sounds more like the difference between perfect and imperfect contrition.
Yeah,
Um,
Yeah, exactly.
okay, because I mean, it
Yeah,
kind of reminds me of, I mean, the very structure of the scriptures, which is you have the kind of the vassalage covenant idea of you're doing things because the law requires you to do it, and then you have the new covenant idea,
yeah,
which is you
right.
do it because of the spirit of sonship.
Yep,
But in
yep,
in the church, you kind of have all of these layers of scripture, part of the structure of the of society.
yep,
So
absolutely.
in that case, I would kind of agree with not the Jansenist, the Jesuit here. But anyway, okay, makes sense.
Well,
Um,
the Jesuits definitely won that debate, as far as,
yeah.
because, and when I would teach this with students, they would usually sort of grasp onto this way more than the divine grace stuff. They were like, whoa, I only
Yeah.
just heard some Calvinist say that one time on the internet. I didn't even know that was a debate. But with this,
Mhm.
we still kind of think about this, and we talk about this, and we feel bad if, I'm in confession every week, it's the same stuff. Am I
Yeah.
really,
Mhm.
how sincere is my amendment? So I think, because we can existentially connect with this question way better than election, physical
Yeah.
pre-motion, all that kind of stuff. So
Yeah.
basically what happens is that the powers that be in France don't like this, what they see as an extreme rigorism. And they think that it is causing this sort of sect of people that aren't very good for the state. It's causing these young men to leave their careers as lawyers and go live in the woods outside Port Royal, reading
Yeah.
Augustine all day and gardening, and stuff.
Yeah.
And the Jansenists saw it as, we're creating this kind of pure Jerusalem.
Mm.
So again, we deal with this with, really intense traditionalist or really intense charismatic communities who want a
Mhm.
kind of separation from the world. All of these spiritual, social impulses
Mhm.
are still with us. So anyway, Antoine Arnauld
Yeah.
becomes the main leader. He has that really important book on communion, and he argues you should delay absolution until a person has a firm amendment, or sorry,
Okay.
has a perfect contrition. I am
Okay.
here because I love God, not because I'm afraid that my boss is going to find out I stole from him or whatever.
Mhm.
He's kicked out of the Sorbonne, which is the preeminent theology faculty in France. It's
Okay.
in Paris. And there was what was second thing I was going to bring up. I mean, Arnaud's career is he lives until 1694. He's one of the most important Catholics of 17th century France. There was a second theme the distinction. Another important element here is just a distinction between fact and right is made. So when the Pope condemns these 5 propositions from Jansen's book, the Jansenists are in crisis, or the supporters of Jansen are in crisis. So Antoine Arnauld comes up with this idea, and he says, okay, we respect papal authority to condemn false doctrine. We accept that the Pope has condemned 5 false ideas, but they're false in the sense when interpreted falsely, not when interpreted. So he basically says there is a Calvinist interpretation of these 5 propositions that is wrong, but there's also an Augustinian interpretation that is not wrong.
Yeah.
And he also claims these propositions are actually not in the book.
Yeah.
So there's the Pope is right about his right to condemn, but the fact of whether they're in the book is not true.
Yeah.
So for example, if you wrote a book and the CDF said this guy's getting too popular and now these seminarians are reading this guy Dom's book and it's heretical, and they say Dom's ideas are XYZ, and you go, that's not my idea, I don't accept that, right? So that would be like a fact right distinction.
Yeah, that's a fair distinction, I think. Yeah.
Well,
no.
Well, I mean, I agree with you, but the papacy didn't like it.
Yeah, not that you should disobey, but it's in theory, it's fair. Okay.
The idea was that the church could infallibly judge doctrine, but not facts.
Yeah.
It's infallible when it says author X said fact Y.
I see. Okay, it makes sense. Yeah. So
this goes on and on and on, but we don't need to get sidetracked on it.
Yeah. No, it does all the time. Okay, so how do we put in a nutshell what Jansenism is? Maybe we can get into the metaphysics more, grace, free will, and stuff like that. Take it wherever you'd like. I just want to learn.
Yeah, sure. So at this point, we're now, let's say we're around 1700 AD.
Okay.
So Jansen's dead. The first generation of all the nuns are dead, and there's a second generation with Antoine Arnauld. A guy named Pasquier Quesnel becomes really important. I would say at this point, it's a group, or it's a network, or I hate to be so like hair splitting, or it's a tendency, because it kind of depends on who you're talking about and when and where, but it's a phenomenon. I love that word because it just means thing. It's a phenomenon. It's an extreme Augustinian tendency towards sacramental discipline, towards views of divine grace. It takes on a kind of sectarian-like ethos, especially in France. It has a subtle resistance of papal and royal authority that becomes not subtle at all in the 18th century, but is originally, I think, more subtle. So I think it's more helpful to talk about it as like a set of orientations and trends rather than a distinct idea, because like today we're like, predestination, I don't like that. But at the time, even a Molinist would say, I believe in predestination. I just think God predestined Dom with the foreknowledge that Dom would accept.
Right.
So everyone agrees that predestination is a thing. Everyone agrees that the elect are saved. So obviously there are certain ideas Jansenists held which were condemned, but then you get into all this complication of holding something in an Augustinian or a Calvinist sense, the true sense of Augustine, all that kind of stuff. So I think it's more helpful to say there's a set of tendencies and attitudes that gets called Jansenism. So it's similar to modernism in that sense, right? It's like this umbrella term, and it's a question of kind of there's some people that you can go, clearly Alfred Loisy and George Tyrrell are modernists, but then there's a whole range of people where it's like modernist tendency. Are they owning it, but in order to deconstruct it, etc. So I hope that's not too vague. My students would get really mad when I wouldn't just like clearly define.
Well, I think that's really the point, right? Is that sometimes it's, the fact that it's hard to define, it makes it easy to weaponize, actually.
Yeah, exactly.
Because if you don't like someone, well, you're a Jansenist or you're a modernist. Yeah.
And the Pope in 1694, I think it was Innocent the 12th, actually wrote a brief, like an official papal letter to the bishops in the Spanish Netherlands saying, you are not to accuse someone of Jansenism unless it's publicly, manifestly clear on the basis of the 5 propositions. So,
Hmm.
so you couldn't say, oh, the confessor at the church at blah, blah, blah is a Jansenist just because you heard he was, denying people absolution or whatever.
Right.
Because it immediately got weaponized. There's a famous
Yeah.
incident where a Benedictine cardinal in Rome is arguing with the general of the Jesuits, and he says, it basically the end of it's like a kind of joke anecdote, but at the end he basically says, okay, so everyone who hates a Jesuit then is a
Is it
Jansenist, and then he
Jansenist?
goes, that's an infinite number of people, and then the
Yeah.
superior of the Jesuits, then they were friends, but
Yeah.
it got to be that kind of vibe, if you're right of
Hmm.
me, you're a trad. If you're left of me, you're a modernist. It's the
Yeah.
same type of dynamic.
Makes sense. Yeah. Yeah. And how do you navigate those waters? Okay, let's maybe see how this unfolds. Um, so this is broad. So we have this period from 1690 all the
Mm-hmm.
way to 1800. And so from the death of Antoine,
Arnauld, yeah.
and involved here is the Synod of Pistoia, which we're going to talk about, and also the
Mm-hmm.
French Revolution. So could you unpack that era and try to help us make sense of what's happening here?
Yeah, sure, sure. So we have Jansen and Saint and the nuns of Port Royal. That's generation 1.
Hmm.
Generation 2, you have Antoine Arnauld. He dies in 1694 in exile in the Low Countries, Belgium. And
Hmm.
his successor is a guy named Pasquier Quesnel. And Quesnel is an ex-Oratorian who is called the Elisha of Arnauld. So like
Oh, I
Arnauld is
see.
Elijah and Quesnel. And they were developing a kind of in language of, we are the preservers of the truth. We're kind of the kind of a church within a church thing, which I think was
Yeah.
really dangerous and ultimately was their undoing. But Quesnel is a brilliant theologian, biblical commentator, and he writes a really popular book called Moral Reflections on the New Testament, is how we translate it, Reflections Morales. And this book becomes symbolic of a kind of Jansenist alternative spirituality and theological world. It's not just issues of divine grace, it's also liturgy, Bible
Mm.
reading, even some ecclesiological issues, because this is the time of the kind of the 4 Gallican articles were declared by the Assembly of the French Clergy in 1682. That was kind of a rebuke of what we now call ultramontanism.
Right.
And Jansenists really latch onto that. It was their honest belief, but it was also a shield, of course, against papal
Wait.
interference.
Jansenists were Gallicans, is what you're saying.
Yes, so
Okay.
not
Okay.
all Gallicans were Jansenists. In
Okay.
fact, a great many of them were not. But all Jansenists would have said the basic Gallican perspective is correct,
Okay. And
vis-a-vis the papacy.
yeah, and for the audience, could you maybe help us understand better this Gallicanism versus Ultramontanism dispute?
Yeah, sure. So it really goes back to the late Middle Ages, which we, of course, don't have time to talk about, but the conciliarist
Yeah.
era and everything. But essentially, the Gallican, in 1682, under the leadership of King Louis XIV and Bishop Bossuet. Bishop Bossuet is
Yeah.
actually a brilliant
I've read some
theologian
of
and
his
writer.
stuff when I was younger. Yeah, it's quite beautiful, actually. Yeah.
He was they say he was the greatest preacher of his era.
Yeah.
And he was obviously a brilliant writer as well. And his memory,
Mhm.
interestingly, has survived the Gallican, because there was, of course, a very harsh backlash against Gallicanism. But Bossuet, in many ways, I think people just enjoyed his writing so much that they
Yeah.
kept reading him, just like Pascal
Yeah.
with Jansenism.
Same. Yeah, Pascal. Yeah.
Let me just look at. So I have in Denzinger here the Gallican articles. So
Okay.
basically, article number 1 says, kings and princes are not subject to ecclesiastical power in temporal affairs, nor can they be deposed by the authority of the keys, meaning the papacy. Okay, so this is like basically the original Boniface VIII versus Philip IV dispute.
Yes. Unam sanctam being that
Exactly.
bull that set its foot on that. Okay. Okay.
Exactly right. Yeah. So the French never accepted that. They never received that bull as valid. And honestly, a lot of people around Europe would have denied the deposing power.
Really?
The lines between ultramontanism and conciliarism were very blurry, sort of depending on the question. So you would have Germans who would concur with papal infallibility, but in doctrine, and they would
Yeah.
not accept the deposing power, that sort of thing.
Gotcha.
The second is basically the Pope is not above the ecumenical council.
Mm.
So the decrees of Constance are valid and binding in
Okay.
perpetuity. Number 3 is the canons of the Gallican Church are sacrosanct. So basically, each local church has a kind of ecclesiastical and legal heritage, and the Pope's job is only to intervene when there's like some sort of abuse or problem. So the
Okay.
Pope doesn't have kind of jurisdiction over the traditions of the local churches, which would
Okay.
come in very handy today for people who don't like
Yes. Yes.
meddling in
Yeah.
question of discipline. And then the fourth one is really important for Vatican I. The fourth one is in questions of faith, the Roman Pontiff has the principal part. So he's more authoritative than any other bishop. However, his judgment is not unalterable, is what this translation says. The Latin is irreformable, which is what Vatican I says, irreformabile esse judicium nisi. So nevertheless, his judgment is not unalterable unless the consent of the church is added, consensus ecclesiae. So this is nullified by Vatican I. And that was the really contentious issue between the moderate remaining conciliarists at Vatican I and the ultramontanists. So this is a very public declaration of kind of, hey, this is how we do things in France. Stop meddling. And the funny thing is, Louis XIV is all in favor of this, but when he wants Jansenists condemned, he says, "Oh, why are you? You don't need a parliament to look at all that. Just accept this is Blessed Peter. So Louis XIV is the bad actor in this. The Pope really believed in his perspective, and the Jansenists really believed in theirs. But you have a philandering, power hungry king who will hop back and forth.
Yeah. Okay. I kind of got you off track. So bringing us back to the Jansenist era here.
Right. Sure. Okay. Yeah. Sorry, that was a big digression, but I do think
it's good.
It's necessary to understand kind of what happens next. So the Jansenism is still a thing despite everything that Louis XIV has done and all the help he's gotten from the papacy. So he's getting towards the end of his life. He really wants to consolidate power in France. And he physically destroys the convent of Port Royal. He rounds up all the nuns and ships them off to various other convents where they're unfortunately in many cases treated very, very poorly, deprived of the sacraments, etc. And he physically destroys Port Royal. He disinters all the graves because he doesn't want there to be a kind of relic industry there. And it's really a sad chapter in church history. And then he petitions the Pope, who at this point is Clement XI, to condemn this book by Quesnel. So Pasquier Quesnel, the successor of Arnauld, writes this biblical commentary, which my friend Rick Yoder and I have this anthology of Jansenist texts coming out, and our other colleague John Meinert has translated part of Quesnel's writing commentary on the Gospel of John. It's actually really beautiful. So he condemns 101 propositions taken from this book, and they're taken verbatim. So this is to not have a repetition of the Jansen fiasco where people say it's not really in the book or it's not really what he meant. So the bull Unigenitus, only begotten, in 1713 condemns 101 propositions from Quesnel's book, and they're verbatim, but the condemnations are listed at the very end. So the condemnations at the end, this is Denzinger 2502. After listing all 101 propositions, the bull continues, "We declare, condemn, reject the preceding propositions as the case may be," and then it lists all the possible censures. False, my favorite is offensive to pious ears.
Yeah.
pernicious, rash, and then going all the way up to erroneous, heretical, etc. But it doesn't assign the condemnations to each proposition. So that now you have decades more of debate
Infighting. Yeah.
and fighting about that. But Unigenitus is the most important ecclesial rift in 18th century Catholicism until the suppression of the Jesuits in 1773, although it's very much connected with that.
Okay.
So that's the next chapter of the story is Unigenitus.
Okay, fascinating. So, Unigenitus is basically the official stamp of Jansenism as a no-go from now on by the Holy See. Okay.
Well, so the Holy See would basically say Canel is the successor of Jansen. We already condemned Jansen. Now we're condemning Canel.
Okay.
Stop reading this stuff. Stop talking about this stuff.
Okay.
Our apostolic authority has made clear this is a no-go.
Okay.
But
and
that just led to more debate.
Yeah, of course. Okay, so Pistoia is after the Pistoia is right before the revolution, right?
Pistoia is right before the revolution. Yep.
Okay, so let's maybe at your pace
fast forward.
Yeah, up to you. Yeah, up to Pistoia. Yeah.
Okay, so we're skipping over a lot, but maybe we'll talk another time. And there's a number of fascinating kind of ways that this all plays out.
Mm-hmm.
But essentially what happens is in France, you get something of a ceasefire. There's a major controversy in the 1750s over denying communion to suspected Jansenists. And the Pope at the time, who I think is one of the greatest popes in history, Benedict XIV, he comes down and says, unless someone is publicly, manifestly, and repeatedly denying the authority of their bishop or the Pope, don't deny them communion. And so that really helps to be something of a peace in France in the 1750s. The problem is, by that time, Jansenism was becoming a kind of Europe-wide phenomenon. The problem from the perspective of the papacy. So you get Jansenist sort of sympathizers. You could say in English, philo-Jansenists. So the Italian historians call these philo-Jansenisti, like, we say I'm philo whatever, in favor of whatever. So Europe is splitting. European Catholicism and in the Americas and overseas is splitting into kind of philo-Jesuit. So philo-Jesuit pro-papal and kind of philo-Jansenist pro
Gallicanism type.
Yeah, exactly. Pro kind of royalist. Some people call it regalism. So like the Church of France is a state church that has its autonomous jurisdiction, etc. So that's a rift that Pope Benedict XIV really does an excellent job of not letting that rip the church apart. But his successor, Clement XIII, does not do as good of a job and makes a couple of really bad blunders, and it blows up. And then his successor is essentially forced to dissolve the Jesuit order in 1773.
Okay, why? Why the Jesuit order?
Well, the problem is we could talk about that for the whole time. Well, I'll just say in brief, the Jesuit order was seen as they made a number of enemies for a number of different reasons. They were by far the most, well, I've got to be careful if Dominicans are listening, but they were by far the most dynamic religious order. They were all over the world. They educated a huge amount of the future generation, not just the wealthy. They also educated the poor in many cases. So they did a lot of really good things, but they were seen by sovereigns and princes as a potential fifth column in society because they reported to a Roman superior. They could get moved around. They weren't under episcopal jurisdiction, and they maintained ultramontane theories. They would usually temper them if they were in France. So you get a kind of accommodation to Gallicanism to some extent. But they were the ones that were like, the papal claims in Unum Sanctum are basically the way it ought to be. It just isn't. It's not pragmatic or prudential, but they would hold to a really, really high kind of ultramontane ecclesiology, and that is not going to win you friends in late 18th century.
That's been essential to the Jesuit order from its very inception.
Exactly.
Because they took oaths of fidelity to the Pope when they started their order.
That's right. So in France, when they're suppressed, the parliaments, they have all these regional parliaments. The parliaments argue on the basis of the constitution of the Jesuits, they are a problem and irreformable, and they have to be suppressed, whereas it went down differently in different places. But in 1773, Pope Clement XIV, who was a Franciscan, Ganganelli was his name, he suppresses the entire Jesuit order, but he was essentially, he really had no choice at that point.
Okay, makes sense.
So the superior general of the Jesuits at the time is a man named Ricci, and he is the grand uncle of a young, very intelligent, very energetic Italian priest named Scipione de' Ricci. Scipione de' Ricci goes to Rome as a young man, and he's in the circles of all these philo-Jansenists. So there's a couple cardinals, there's some the head of the Vatican Library. There's a lot of intellectuals. They're usually antiquarians. They love reading the Church Fathers, love obviously St. Augustine, very anti-Jesuit. They have a polemic against sort of superstition, bigotry, fanaticism. So you have an interesting overlap with what we call Catholic Enlightenment, which is ironic because the Jansenists they had such a pessimistic anthropology, and yet on certain questions, they were very much in line with the sort of Catholic Enlightenment. So they're anti-scholastic, they're anti-Thomist. They want what they call positive theology, which is theology directly based on Scripture and the Church Fathers. So what we would call ressourcement today.
Now,
not the same as, because we have Thomist ressourcement, but they are anti-Thomistic back to the Fathers. Go ahead.
Sorry to interrupt you. I'm so fascinated. It sounds like there's just too much to talk about, but
yeah. So well, it's my fault because I go off on tangents because
it's totally fine. Yeah.
I find this era so fascinating.
Yeah. So, but you're saying that there's a bunch of philo-Jansenists in Rome,
right?
How does that work? Because they're supposed to be against Ultramontanism, right?
Yeah. Great question. So, in Italy, there would be sympathizers of Jansenists that they're more anti-Jesuit than they are anti-papal. Okay. So what they want is they want the right Pope in the 1740s and 50s. So they think papal claims are exaggerated, but they're not. They don't hate the papacy by any stretch. No, none of these people hate the papacy. They think the papacy is de jure divino, founded by Jesus, and yet they think it's far exceeded its brief. So it's a lot like today for some folks. But they're not. I mean, it's uncomfortable. It's uncomfortable for the papacy, and it causes a huge rift. But it's a time. The 1740s and 50s are a time of kind of sifting through a lot of dynamic tension, and then it really gets polarized after the suppression in 1773. Okay, and then you have really aggressive anti-Ultramontanism. So essentially Gallicanism all around Europe, Spain, Portugal, the Holy Roman Empire. It's not just France.
What I find fascinating is there's all these different combinations of, for example, ressourcement on one side, but Gallicanism hand in hand with it, or Ultramontanism, and yet a kind of scholasticism. And today things are kind of in different combinations.
Absolutely, exactly.
I find that fascinating.
Yeah, that's very perceptive of you. I keep wanting to write. I haven't had time to write this, but I wanted to write something on how contemporary Catholic general theological orientation that you'd get in a seminary or a Roman, maybe in the Congregation for the Doctrine of Faith, is a combination of things that in the 18th century would be philo-Jesuit and philo-Jansenist. And I find that actually really hopeful because today when I disagree, I look at people I disagree with and I think, gosh, I can't believe they're completely wrong about all these things. And then I go, oh, hold on a second. No single 18th century figure we look at now and agree completely with their perspective. There's truth in both of these camps, if you will. And the people I really admire are people like Benedict XIV and his close friend, Italian priest and historian named Ludovico Muratori, because they tried to mediate between these two groups. And they did a really good job. And after their death in the 1750s, things really polarized. And so that's a call for dialogue, Irenicism, assuming the best of people, because you may learn something, you may temper your own, maybe you've gone too far in one direction. So I think that's a very perceptive point that you've made.
Okay. So continuing with the Pistoia narrative, because I'm very interested in this. You said Ricci was a Jesuit. Is that what you said?
Sorry, the Bishop Scipione de'
bishop.
Ricci is
Okay.
the great nephew of the last superior general of the Jesuits. So these
Okay.
divisions were even within families,
Okay.
and so these people knew each other. So
Okay.
that's why I bring that up.
Okay.
I can't remember the name of the Jesuit. I think his name was Lorenzo Ricci. He's famous as being the last superior general before the suppression. And sadly, he
Okay.
was imprisoned in Castel Sant'Angelo and died in prison. So it's a very
Mm.
sad story. But his great nephew, Scipione de' Ricci, was this young, intelligent, wealthy
Philo-Jansenist.
priest, Philo-Jansenist, and he becomes radically Jansenist when he spends time in Rome, which is, again, ironic. And his perspective is basically that I think he hid it effectively until he was made bishop, but he really thinks that Rome has completely gone off the rails doctrinally into a Philo-Jesuitism, and that it's his job and his friends to radically correct the Catholic theological and ecclesiastical world. So he has a very serious plan. He has an international network, partly linked with the Church of Utrecht, who had been excommunicated by the papacy for a complex thing, but they were a kind of hotbed of Jansenist exiles. They start pouring Jansenist texts into Italy. So Ricci and his friends are translating all this French stuff into Italian, distributing it to parish priests. So there's a real Italian Jansenist movement in the 1770s and 1780s. So that's the origins of the Synod of Pistoia.
Okay. Origins makes sense. Now, what did this synod teach, and what was the reaction of Rome?
So Ricci is named bishop of, at this time, the Tuscany is a state, because Italy is not a country yet. So Tuscany, with the capital in Florence, is ruled by the Austrian emperor's younger brother. His name is Peter Leopold. These are the older brothers of Marie Antoinette. So Peter Leopold, young, energetic, intense, confident. He wants to reform the church, wants to modernize the state, modernize the economy, all these different things. His mother, Maria Theresia, had really gotten into these kind of reformist Catholic sources. So he was raised on this kind of Philo-Jansenist perspective. It didn't come to his sexual life. He wasn't rigorous about his sexual life, apparently, but he was very rigorous about priests and other people's lives, unfortunately. But he really likes Ricci, so he convinces the Pope to not veto, essentially. So the Grand Duke appoints, but the Pope has the right to veto. He convinces the Pope not to veto. Ricci becomes Bishop of Pistoia, which is a town outside of Florence. He's technically bishop of a united see, Pistoia and Prato, which are both small-ish towns outside Florence. Would both have beautiful cathedrals, kind of Renaissance, amazing. They're like little mini Florences, really. Anyway, Ricci starts this very, very radical, intense reform. He suppresses devotion to the Sacred Heart, which antagonizes the new Pope, Pius VI. He really,
because of Nestorian fears.
Well, yes, they're afraid. The original critique was that the Sacred Heart was potentially Nestorian, by positing a separation between the physical heart of Jesus apart from the body or something like that.
Okay.
But it became a symbol of the Jesuits, and it was promoted by the Jesuits. So it was a kind of a nasty, totally effacing the memory of the Jesuits, and
I see.
all the problems we have are ultimately their fault, and that's why the people are superstitious and they don't read the Bible, and it's because of the Jesuits. And it was really there were valid critiques of Jesuits, but these people were really fanatics, and their bitterness blinded them, I think, to all the good things that the Jesuits and the Franciscans were doing. So anyway, he antagonizes all these people. He does do some really, really great things. He encourages Bible reading. He systematizes the way the parishes work in a much more equitable way. He raises the education of the priests. So there, like all these things, is a real combination of good and bad. In 1786, he decides, with the permission of the Grand Duke, to have a diocesan synod. And the goals of the synod are really way beyond what a diocesan synod would ever need to do. It's really kind of like a rerun of the Council of Trent, and it's a sort of test reform for the whole church. So what they're hoping happens is the Synod of Pistoia gets imitated by this Synod of Florence, and then the Synod of Bologna, and then the Synod of Milan, and then boom, all the way to Portugal, Hungary, the New World. So they want this radical Gallican Jansenist reform of the entire Catholic Church, which would ultimately force the papacy back into its proper confines as the sort of guardian of the canons, the last court of appeal, elder brother amongst brothers, that kind of deal. So they have a series. I actually have I bought the decrees, or rather I should say my very sweet wife bought me this for Christmas, which is probably the strangest Christmas present anyone's ever asked for. But all the decrees of the Synod of Pistoia. So you couldn't possibly deliberate about this in 8 days.
Yeah.
So obviously this was pre-prepared theological material from Ricci and his circle of theologians. And this causes an absolute uproar in Europe when the news of what Ricci is doing, pro and con. So anyway, I don't know how much detail we can go into about the synod itself, but
well, maybe point out some of the good and the bad, and then we can tie that into, and also maybe mention the French Revolution, and then we can tie that into the Second Vatican Council as a good way to cap off the this conversation. Yeah,
sure. So I would say the synod, the bad things. I wrote up a list. So it needlessly antagonized Rome and the Pope. Needlessly antagonized the mendicant orders. So Ricci wanted all the religious orders to combine into one order under the rule of Saint Benedict. So as a kind of primitivist understanding that this is okay, but we shouldn't have Franciscans, Dominicans, all these, and he had some good critiques, but this is
still
totally
kind of extreme.
And it's totally unilateral, and it was never going to work, even if it was a good idea. He advocated an unrealistic amount of change, so too much too soon, especially regarding the people's devotional life. So most of these people are illiterate. So encouraging Bible reading is a really good thing. But a lot of these people can't read the Bible, and their connection to the faith is images and candles and processions. And he started really kind of marginalizing all of this. Does this maybe sound familiar for some post-Vatican II type stuff? He cast doubt on the veracity of relics, which is a tricky matter because, you want to be venerating true relics. On the other hand, you don't want to be sort of spoiling everyone's cherished devotions. So that's a kind of, he's doing a lot of stuff that's ambiguous in Trent. Like a lot of this is unresolved Tridentine reform. Trent says remove false relics, but the way that was interpreted was like manifestly false. We're not going to dig too much about how old this arm bone of St. Andrew is or whatever it might be. So he just went full steam ahead and bulldozed, and really I think offended a lot of good people who otherwise might have been on board. It reads very arrogantly. The Synod documents read arrogantly in places, and I think there's an excessive trust in the sovereign and in the state to enact reforms that are basically ecclesial, because they're so alienated from the papacy that they end up making a deal with the devil, so to speak.
Having recourse.
Leopold wasn't the devil, but trust not in princes, it says in the scripture, and I think that's something that they didn't take to heart. So as far as good things, there's some really beautiful Christocentric passages. There's some really amazing stuff that is ultimately comes from kind of the French spiritual school, Bérulle, Pascal, stuff like that. There's a real emphasis on the Bible, the importance of the Bible. There's a liturgical reform that, at least I think in many cases, was a lot of what they were doing was good. The priest would pronounce the canon out loud. They would read the Bible they would chant the scripture in Latin, and then they would go up and read it in Italian, which was not always happening before this, in fact,
Yeah.
but would be completely normal in a Latin mass today.
Yeah.
So the mass that they're looking for is similar, I think, to like it's kind of like a Novus Ordo Latin.
Yeah, makes
That's
sense.
kind of the vibe. If you were in a very sort of stripped down church. So they also did stuff like said no flowers on the altar, which just pissed people off and was just
Yeah.
they're trying to say the focus is on the Eucharist. The focus is on the Eucharist, but then they end up being kind of, spoil sports, I guess. The reorganization of the parishes was actually a lasting reform in this diocese that was effective. I think there was a fearlessness in confronting corruption and admitting mistakes, which is maybe the flip side of the rashness. They had an idea of religious liberty. So Peter Leopold had expelled the Inquisition from Tuscany, and they had this idea of you have to reason with heretics and you have to love heretics. And so they have some things that I think are maybe forerunners of Dignitatis Humanae. Their attitude towards Protestants was what you might call proto-ecumenical. So they called Protestants fratelli separati, separated brethren.
Really?
Or fratelli traviati, wandering brethren, brethren who are led astray, but still brethren. And there were non-Jansenists who used this language too, but it's just a positive thing that these people did. So it's a mix of good and bad, but there was no chance of this succeeding without the powers that be in Europe actively protecting it and marginalizing the papacy. And if you're trying to reform the church, that is a deal with the devil, ultimately. So that's ultimately their undoing, I think.
Ironically, it does kind of seem to come down once again to Roman approval. So, so which is interesting. Fascinating. What about collegiality? Anything there?
They certainly, I mean, the flip side of the positive other end of the coin from the Ultramontanism is collegiality, in the sense that they had a patristic understanding of the Catholic Church is a federation of churches, and the bishops are brothers, and you deliberate together, and you don't lord it over each other. So they definitely had a patristic ecclesiology, and that's a very positive thing. The problem is the way that it concretely instantiated was anti-papalism to a level that was too much. But yeah, I think they're forerunners of the notion of certainly they saw it as the proper interpretation of Trent. They saw it as the Tridentine model of the bishop. But of course, that's not how Rome saw it, and I don't think how Borromeo would have found this too extreme, I think. So there are positive ecclesiological content. I think a lot of it also is to do with the laity. They have a real sense of the baptism of, the priesthood of all believers, that we see in First Peter, not in a Protestant sense, or at least in what we caricature as a Protestant sense. I think they had a sense very similar to what we see in the Second Vatican Council.
This is very interesting. I mean, nowadays, the progressives are almost not even part of this conversation because they just want to cave into the world. But in the more traditionalist circles, you kind of have this Gallican attitude, but it goes against a certain form of collegiality in certain instances, but definitely against this antiquarian, going back to the Church Fathers, this kind of downplay of scholasticism. So it's what we were saying earlier. A lot of these elements have been shifted around.
Totally.
And so I find that very interesting. But it seems the thread seems to be that things do work if Rome approves, right? So people had legitimate concerns, be they Jansenists or Jesuits. But at the end of the day, successful reform takes place with Roman approval. I do think that's what we see in Vatican II, which is the elements that some of these philo-Jansenists were pushing for, but also keeping the Jesuit, Ultramontanism is what, and establishing collegiality. This is what the council is seeking. It's kind of a synthesis, really, of reform.
Yeah.
What do you think? Yeah.
No, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, I argue something similar to that in my book, where I think in many ways, Vatican I is completely repudiating Pistoia. I mean, they talk about it in the Acta. They say, like, this is the what do they call them? Ricciani, the Riccians, or Pistoiani. Pistoiensis is the Latin term they say. But so they deliberately reject parts of the Synod of Pistoia for sure. Nevertheless, because the Ultramontanes win at Vatican I, they create this kind of like demilitarized space where you can now, when Ratzinger and Congar and all these people are talking about all this stuff that you actually see with these early modern, bad guys, bad isms, it's not threatening to the papacy anymore in the way that it was at that time, because it's not associated with directly challenging papal authority to judge doctrine or something like that, because none of them did that. They were all thoroughly ultramontane from the perspective of the 18th century. So yeah, I agree. It allows Vatican I in a weird roundabout way, allows for Vatican II, because it allows these kind of out of bounds lines that everyone can sort of reintroduce all of these old ideas in a more constructive way. There's a wonderful French historian who passed away, tragically passed away when he was 40, named Émile Perouse-Sasson. And he has a great book called Catholicism and Democracy. And I got some of what I just said from that. But you picked that up from our conversation, that this is a dynamic of what the long play is, from Jansenism or 18th century conflict to Vatican I to Vatican II. And Vatican I is an important link in the chain that makes Vatican II possible.
And I mean, we see this with the Counter-Reformation as well. It seems to me Reformation only ever works genuinely, when it has the backing of Rome. As Catholics, I feel like it's just common sense. But again, I understand the heated debates and the wounds and all that. I get that. But that's
the problem. But Dom, the problem is, when you and Congar, True and False Reform in the Church, is just so beautifully lays this out with, he grabs stuff from the Middle Ages to his own day to this period. The problem is, reformers are typically super intense people who get obsessed with one idea or two ideas. And when Rome doesn't go along with it or condemns them, it causes these people to have existential crises. And I don't mean to separate myself from that, in the sense that maybe I would react that way if I was, Lamennais or Ricci or any of these people. And then it's like, what do you do? Because you feel that the truth has been condemned, and what do you, and you're thrown into a crisis of conscience. So it's brutally difficult. But Congar, I think, says, look, some reform is only right when the timing is right. So you can have a great idea in the wrong time frame, and if the church isn't ready for that idea, you're just hurting the body, and that's very hard to accept.
I mean, I agree. You see this at the end of one of Ratzinger's works. He kind of bemoans how harshly they dealt with the commentary tradition, the neo-scholastic. And he says, we went a little too far. I would agree with that.
He's funny, because if you read him, I love Ratzinger's writing, but if you read him in the 60s, he's pretty critical, the 60s and 70s. And then in the 80s, he's like, hold on a second. I think he's worried that he became some of the stuff that he was against, as far as throwing out the views of the opponent or the views of the,
And that's why because at one point he says, my theology is consistent. There's different nuances and emphases, but it is essentially consistent. And I truly take him at his word when it comes to that. The reason why there seems to be shifts in Ratzinger, I think, is because there's shifts around him. But I do think he's consistent.
I do think in general, yes. No, I think in general that's true. I do think that he reevaluated later in life.
Yeah.
I think he sees more good in the pre-conciliar church now than he did in the 60s and 70s. But in the 60s and 70s, he's in the thick of the debate. And he's trying to enshrine certain ideas about divine revelation and scripture and all that. And then once that's sort of in the bag, I think he's like, well, he can sort of moderate his views, which is only natural. But I agree with you. I don't see some radical shift in pre-1968, post-1968. I've never really bought that either.
No, and I mean, you see this with de Lubac as well, decrying pre-conciliar problems and post-conciliar problems. Okay, well, and that's another thing is that reform again takes time. The church, there's a grand scale here, and I understand the anxiety and people get up in arms and all that kind of stuff. But the church moves a lot slower than we do, and
Yeah. Oh yeah.
we just got to remember the essentials, which is
Yeah.
sacraments, obedience. Bishop, pope. Of course, there's going to be scandal, chaos, and corruption, but it doesn't take away from the constitution of the church. And I think people get lost on these Twitter wars, these YouTube comments,
Yeah.
and
Yeah. For sure.
these people, and it can be very anxiety inducing. A lot of people have been
Yeah.
reaching out to me saying, what's going on? The church
Yeah.
that I love is going crazy. I'm like, we
Totally.
don't have it that bad compared to like
Yeah.
before the Carolingian Renaissance. I mean, there was
Yeah.
bishops sleeping around, and
Yeah.
it was crazy stuff.
Killing each other and stuff. Yeah,
Yeah.
the real dark age was that stuff in the 900s was
Oh my goodness.
absolutely. It's like it
Yeah.
would be like the worst episode of Game of Thrones is like some of the stuff that was going on at the time. No, I
Oh my
totally
goodness.
agree. I
Yeah.
wanted to say though, with Ricci in particular, the bishop who
Mhm.
presided over the Synod of Pistoia, there was a great American a Jesuit historian. This is the irony: is oftentimes Jesuits do this great historical work on Jansenism. But his name was Samuel J. Miller. He passed away. He was a professor at Boston College, but he had a really comment that stuck with me when I was researching for my book on Pistoia.
Mhm.
The Archbishop of Florence was a man named Martini, and he translated the Bible into Italian. So the first approved Italian Bible since the Counter-Reformation was translated by an anti-Jansenist. Okay, so that's not the narrative, right? The narrative is Jansenists are pro-vernacular scripture, which they were, but that
Yeah.
doesn't mean everyone else was anti. The Archbishop of Bologna was a really, really good man named Gioanetti, and he wanted to collaborate with Ricci, and he thought Ricci had a lot of good ideas, but he was totally turned off by how bitter he was, by how arrogant he was, and by how headstrong he was. So
Yeah.
what Miller said in this article was, if Ricci could have found a effective collaboration, which would have required compromise and would have
Yeah.
required humility with the Cardinal Archbishop of Bologna and the Archbishop of Florence, he probably could have had a synod of the Duchy of Tuscany that would have had lasting positive reform. Rome might have
Yeah.
not liked all of it, but they probably wouldn't have condemned it if
Yeah.
he'd been backed by
Yeah.
the second man in the Papal States and the Archbishop of Florence. But Ricci antagonized them, and
Yeah.
he basically said, "You're either with me or against me. I'm on the side
Yeah.
of truth, and that means you're part of the problem." And that was a huge missed opportunity. And I think Ricci, I don't know what happened at the end of his life, but he has a real note of, meaning I don't know what he thought internally about this, but he has a real note of sadness when you read his letters. He ultimately reconciles with the Pope, which is a beautiful scene. The Pope Pius VII visits him in retirement, and they hug, and Ricci weeps. And it's he had a sense of peace, but I think he really regretted the way his life turned.
Yeah.
And it needn't have been that way. But it's easy for me to say, 200 years later, looking at it. At the time, who knows? I may have acted worse than he did. I don't know.
Well, this is what I love about history. It's applicability. Also, it's just endlessly fascinating. But the viewers will notice we haven't really brought up that much, explicit references to today. I think they're apparent in what we've said, and so that's all we're doing really is presenting history and seeing how maybe that might inform us today. And fascinating topic. I could talk to you for hours, but we have hit the hour and 8-minute mark, so I think it's a good place
sure.
to
Yeah,
stop.
we can wrap up for sure. Let me just say one thing I wanted to say about Vatican II is that
Go ahead. Yeah.
there is a debate. So the Synod of Pistoia, there's all this applicability, which you've drawn, Dom, without me even prompting you, of the way reform works and the way that it can go off the rails or ultimately succeed. But the legacy of the document that condemns the Synod of Pistoia is called Auctorem Fidei. That document becomes really important in the scholastic manuals, seminary education. It gets quoted in papal encyclicals against modernism, against Americanism, against all kinds of things. But at Vatican II, when they're debating debating collegiality, one of the bishops who's wary of collegiality, named Luigi Carli, evokes Auctorem Fidei and says, "Hey, whoa, you know, the Pope has absolute right to intervene in a diocese. He basically quotes passages of Auctorum Fidei, which grievously offends the proponents of collegiality, and there's this massive uproar. Ultimately, the majority obviously say, look, what we're advocating for is fine, and it's patristic, and it doesn't impugn papal primacy. But the minority then privately go to Pope Paul VI, and they go, look, you need to be really careful about this. And Yves Congar has a great line in his diary. He says, the specter of Pistoia was brought to Pope Paul VI. And then Pope Paul VI approves the nota previa explicativa, you know, the explanatory note.
Ratzinger didn't like that one,
Yeah, at the time, yeah. Well, I think he still probably isn't. But I think that's one thing that he maybe would soften on now. But anyway, my point is Pistoia isn't just like in the ether. It's actually explicitly in that debate. It becomes important only for like 2 or 3 days in the council, but it's there, and it's possibly, Congar believed, behind the nota previa, which means in a funny way, Pope Pius VI has the last laugh, actually.
Excellent. Okay, well, thank you so much, Shaun.
Thank you, Dom.
Anytime. For the audience, do you want to plug your books? Maybe do you have a website, anything like that?
You know, I don't really have a personal website. I'm on academia.edu, where I upload citations of my work. And if it's like the Church Life Journal, which I write for a couple times a year, I link those. But I'm at the moment, and speaking of Jansenism, I've just finished with my friend Rick Yoder, who's a doctoral candidate at Penn State University. He works under a great historian of early modern Catholicism. We've co-edited a volume of Jansenist translations, and that is under review at the moment. So it's hopefully everything goes well, and it will be out probably late next year or maybe early the following year. But that's 30 translated texts from 7 different languages.
Wow.
Not all done by us, obviously, done by a team of people. We had a team of about 15 people, but it's men, women, clergy, laity, and everywhere from Portugal to Lebanon. In fact, there's some influence of the Synod of Pistoia with the Melkite Catholics. So it's I don't mean to plug my own thing too enthusiastically, but nothing. We don't know of anything else like that existing, so we're super excited about it. And then I have a short book on Vatican II that I co-wrote with Stephen Bullivant, who would be a great person for you to talk to, by the way. Stephen Bullivant teaches at a Catholic university in London. And so we co-wrote a short book called Vatican II, A Very Short Introduction, and that will be out in March. And that's a quick read, and it's only $10, unlike these massive tomes that are $100, you know. So I'm gonna buy it for my friends for Christmas, the $10 book.
Is there a link already up on Amazon?
There should be a link. It's Oxford University Press, Very Short Introduction. So there should be a link either on their website.
I'll put it in the show notes. If you want.
Sounds good. Yeah, so that should be out in March, and then I'm going to try to find an excuse to write more about Jansenism as soon as possible. So
sounds great. All right. Well, thank you so much, Shaun. Audience, please like this video. Please subscribe. Hit that notification bell. Comment down below. And if you want to support us at patreon.com/the Logos Project. Let me get that banner up. Here we go. All right. Well, thanks again, Shaun, and thank you everyone else. And we'll see you guys next time.
Thanks very much, Tom. Take care.